The morning coffee was still brewing, its aroma filling the quiet kitchen of the home on Elmwood Drive in Ann Arbor, Michigan, when the shots rang out. It was just past 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, a routine morning dissolving instantly into chaos. Within minutes, neighbors, startled by the sharp, unexpected sounds, began cautiously emerging from their homes. They looked towards the modest split-level house at number 1420, a place where nothing outwardly remarkable ever happened. Emergency calls flooded the 911 dispatch center. The initial reports were fragmented. Panic, a shooting, a possible domestic incident, an officer down. The address was confirmed: 1420 Elmwood Drive. This was the home of Detective Mark Jenkins, a 16-year veteran of the Ann Arbor Police Department. His identity added another layer of urgency and grim significance to the unfolding scene. Officers converged on the address, lights flashing, sirens suppressed as they approached. The first patrol unit arrived at 7:18 a.m. They found the front door ajar. Entry was cautious, tactical. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and coffee. The scene was located in the kitchen, the heart of the home. Detective Jenkins was on the floor. It was immediately apparent he was deceased. A handgun lay nearby. The domestic tranquility of the suburban morning had been violently obliterated within those ordinary walls. His wife, Sarah Jenkins, was present. She was standing near the doorway to the living room, visibly distraught but compliant. Her hands were empty. The immediate priority was to secure the scene, ensure no other threats were present, and assess the condition of anyone else inside. There were no other occupants. The only other person in the house was Sarah Jenkins. The arriving officers, colleagues of Mark Jenkins, faced a scene that was both professionally challenging and deeply personal. The kitchen itself told a silent story of interrupted routine. Breakfast items were still on the counter. The coffee maker was on. The ordinary details of a typical morning stood in stark, unsettling contrast to the violence that had just occurred. Crime scene tape, bright yellow and stark, was quickly deployed, cordoning off the property from the rapidly gathering neighbors and news crews. A sense of disbelief settled over Elmwood Drive. Investigators from the department, along with specialized forensic units, were called to the scene. The initial focus was on securing all potential evidence and documenting the scene precisely as it was found. Photographs were taken from multiple angles before anything was moved. The position of the body, the location of the firearm, the presence of shell casings. Every detail was critical. The kitchen, usually a place of comfort and connection, was now a sterile, somber locus of forensic examination. Sarah Jenkins was cooperative but appeared to be in shock. She was quickly and carefully separated from the immediate scene and taken to the police station for questioning. The house on Elmwood Drive became a hive of activity, officers moving with deliberate, measured steps, their faces grim. The weight of the situation was heavy. One of their own was dead, and his wife was the sole person present. The investigation had begun. The truth of what happened in that kitchen awaited discovery, hidden within the physical evidence, and the statements yet to be taken. The mail sat on the porch untouched throughout the day. The initial interview with Sarah Jenkins was conducted in a controlled environment at the Ann Arbor Police Department headquarters. She was read her rights. Detectives noted her demeanor, shaken, tearful, but answering questions. Her first account was fragmented, describing a sudden argument, confusion, and then the shots. She stated the gun belonged to Mark, that he kept it accessible. She described fear, but her initial words offered no clear motive or sequence of events that fully explained the fatal shots. The investigators listened, taking meticulous notes, observing every nuance of her response. Meanwhile, the forensic team worked methodically at the Elmwood Drive residence. The kitchen floor was analyzed for blood spatter patterns, which could indicate the positions of the victim and the shooter during the incident. Shell casings were located and collected. The firearm was carefully documented and seized. It was a standard-issue semi-automatic handgun, consistent with what a police officer might own. But its specific registration and history would be critical pieces of evidence. The trajectory of the bullets was also a primary focus, with investigators examining walls and cabinets for impact points. Neighbors on Elmwood Drive, interviewed by patrol officers canvassing the area, expressed shock. The Jenkinses were seen as a quiet couple. Mark was known in the community as the cop next door, a friendly face. Sarah was perceived as reserved. No one reported hearing prolonged arguments or seeing signs of significant marital discord leading up to that morning. Their accounts painted a picture of ordinary suburban life, making the violence within their home even more unsettling. They seemed normal, one neighbor stated, a common refrain echoed by others. This public perception contrasted sharply with the reality uncovered inside the house. Detectives began building a timeline of the morning. Mark Jenkins' shift had ended hours before. He was off duty. What transpired between his return home and the shooting at 7? Who was awake? What was said? These questions formed the core of the initial inquiry. The morning coffee ritual, the untouched breakfast, all suggested a degree of normalcy immediately preceding the violence. This normalcy, juxtaposed with the outcome, was a significant area of focus. Investigators also began looking into Mark Jenkins' professional life. 16 years on the force. A detective. What kind of cases did he work? Did he have enemies? Was his work related to the incident? These lines of inquiry were standard procedure in the death of an officer, but they initially yielded no immediate connections to his death in his own kitchen. His colleagues expressed grief and disbelief, describing him as competent and well-liked. The focus began to narrow, turning back to the domestic sphere. The initial hours provided a grim picture: a dead officer, his wife present, a shooting in their home. The physical evidence collection was ongoing, the forensic analysis just beginning. Sarah Jenkins remained at the station, her initial statements providing a foundation, however shaky, for the narrative. The truth of what happened on Elmwood Drive was still obscured, waiting for the careful, systematic process of investigation to bring it into focus. The quiet suburban street held its breath, grappling with the violent intrusion into its peaceful existence. As the investigation progressed into the second day, detectives began to piece together a more detailed picture of the Jenkins household and the events leading up to the shooting. While Sarah Jenkins's initial statement was vague about the specific trigger for the argument, follow-up questioning sought to establish a clearer sequence. She described a tense conversation that morning, escalating rapidly. The subject of the argument remained somewhat guarded in her account, focusing more on the emotional intensity than specific details. This vagueness was noted by investigators. Physical evidence from the kitchen was undergoing preliminary analysis. The handgun, a Glock 17, was registered to Mark Jenkins. Ballistics confirmed the recovered shell casings were fired from that weapon. The number of shots fired was critical. Initial reports indicated multiple shots. Blood spatter analysis was particularly important. The patterns suggested the victim was in a specific position relative to the shooter when the shots were fired. This forensic data would be used to test the credibility of any narrative provided by Sarah Jenkins or developed by investigators. The victim's body was transported to the Washtenaw County Medical Examiner's office for autopsy. This examination would determine the precise cause and manner of death, the number and location of entry wounds, and the trajectory of the bullets through the body. These findings would be compared against the scene analysis and Sarah Jenkins' account. Preliminary reports from the medical examiner's office arrived within 24 hours, providing crucial anatomical details that helped investigators reconstruct the event. The trajectory information, in particular, offered silent testimony to the dynamic within the kitchen at the moment of the shooting. Detectives expanded their interviews beyond immediate neighbors. They spoke with Mark Jenkins' colleagues at the police department, his close friends, and family members. They also sought to speak with Sarah Jenkins' family and friends. These interviews aimed to uncover any underlying tensions, long-standing issues, or recent events that might have contributed to the morning's tragedy. Were there financial problems? Marital counseling? Any history of domestic disputes, reported or unreported? A picture of the couple's private life began to emerge. Piece by painstaking piece, information began to surface that hinted at complexities beneath the surface of the quiet suburban couple. Reports from certain friends and family suggested periods of strain in the Jenkins marriage, though the specific causes were often vague or attributed to typical marital disagreements. No one, however, reported anything that would explicitly foreshadow fatal violence. The contrast between the public facade and the emerging private reality became more pronounced. During a subsequent interview, confronted with preliminary physical evidence and inconsistencies in her timeline, Sarah Jenkins became more specific about the argument. She stated it was about something deeply personal, something she had recently discovered. This shift in her narrative was significant. It moved away from a general, sudden escalation and towards a specific, precipitating event. Detectives pressed for details about this discovery. The nature of this revelation was hinted at, but not fully articulated in this early stage of the investigation, leaving a critical gap. The truth of the Elmwood Drive shooting remained just out of reach, obscured by the emotional turmoil and the carefully measured release of information from the central figure. The investigation zeroed in on the deeply personal discovery Sarah Jenkins mentioned. Detectives began reviewing digital evidence. Mark Jenkins' work computer was secured and analyzed, though initial findings related only to his professional duties. His personal phone records and digital footprint became a priority. Call logs, text messages, emails, and social media activity were meticulously examined. This process was time-consuming but often yielded crucial insights into a person's relationships and activities outside the home. It was within this digital examination that the first concrete evidence of the affair surfaced. Text messages and call logs indicated frequent, often late-night communication between Mark Jenkins and another woman. The nature of these communications left little doubt about a relationship extending beyond friendship. The critical piece of information that quickly emerged was the identity of this woman, Laura Miller. Laura Miller was Sarah Jenkins' sister. The victim had been having an affair with his wife's sister. This revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the investigation. It provided a clear, powerful motive for intense marital conflict. It also lent significant credibility to Sarah Jenkins' claim of a deeply personal discovery. The timeline of the affair, as indicated by the digital records, suggested it had been ongoing for a significant period, possibly months. How and exactly when Sarah discovered it became the next critical question. Did she find the communications herself? Was she told? Investigators sought to interview Laura Miller. Her initial reaction was described as distraught and reluctant. She confirmed the affair with Mark Jenkins, but was evasive about the details of its duration and how Sarah might have learned about it. Her statement corroborated the existence of the affair, but provided limited insight into the dynamics between the two sisters or between Laura and Mark in the context of Sarah's knowledge. Her position as both the sister of the accused and the lover of the deceased placed her in a profoundly difficult and legally precarious situation. The discovery of the affair provided a new lens through which to view the relationship dynamics between Mark and Sarah Jenkins. Friends and family who had previously described vague marital issues now offered context. Arguments that might have seemed trivial could have been fueled by underlying suspicion or tension related to the infidelity, even if not explicitly addressed. The normal facade of the suburban couple began to crumble under the weight of this secret. Sarah Jenkins' account of the morning was revisited in light of this information. Did she confront him about the affair that morning? Was that the catalyst for the argument? Her subsequent statements confirmed that the argument was about the affair. She described confronting Mark with evidence she had found. The argument escalated rapidly from there. This confrontation happening in the kitchen, leading directly to the shooting, provided a harrowing sequence of events rooted in betrayal. The idyllic image of morning coffee and breakfast was now irrevocably stained by the reality of a marriage imploding with fatal consequences. The secret was out, and its exposure proved deadly. With the motive of marital infidelity firmly established, the investigation entered a new phase, focusing on the precise moments leading up to the shooting and the forensic evidence that could support or contradict Sarah Jenkins' evolving account. Sarah stated that during the heated argument about the affair, Mark became aggressive. She claimed he reached for his gun, which he kept in a kitchen drawer, or on a nearby shelf. She described a struggle, a moment of panic, and then firing the weapon. Forensic analysis of the scene became paramount in evaluating this claim of struggle and self-defense. The blood spatter patterns were re-examined in detail. The trajectory of the bullets was meticulously mapped. Autopsy results confirmed the entry points and path of the bullets through Mark Jenkins' body. This data was used to create a spatial reconstruction of the event. If there was a struggle over the gun, the physical evidence might show signs of it. Defensive wounds on the victim, DNA evidence on the weapon from both individuals, or blood spatter patterns inconsistent with the victim simply standing upright. The location of the gun when it was fired was also critical. Was it in Mark Jenkins' hand, or did Sarah gain control of it? Fingerprint and DNA analysis on the weapon were performed. While DNA on a firearm can be complex to interpret, especially in a shared household, the presence or absence of specific profiles, particularly on the grip and trigger, could provide clues. Preliminary forensic findings, indicated that Sarah Jenkins' fingerprints and DNA were present on the weapon. This was consistent with her firing it, but did not, on its own, disprove a struggle. However, some of the forensic evidence began to present challenges to a simple self-defense narrative. The blood spatter analysis suggested Mark Jenkins was in a relatively low position when at least some of the shots were fired, possibly on the floor or stooping. The trajectory analysis from the autopsy corroborated this, showing a downward path for some bullets. If the shooting occurred during a struggle while he was reaching for the gun or standing aggressively, some patterns might be expected to differ. This physical evidence created ambiguity. Was he falling? Was he already down? Investigators also looked at the number of shots fired. Multiple shots were confirmed. While panic can lead to multiple shots, the number and placement could also be considered in evaluating intent. Was this a single defensive action, or a sustained firing? Sarah Jenkins's account of the moment of shooting remained emotionally charged, but lacked clinical precision about the sequence and number of shots she fired. Witness statements were revisited, particularly those from neighbors who heard the shots. Could they provide any information about the timing or spacing of the shots? Did anyone hear screams or sounds of a struggle before the shots? Most neighbors reported hearing only the distinct, sharp cracks of the gunfire, not a prolonged disturbance beforehand. This offered limited help in reconstructing the immediate lead-up. The focus sharpened on the kitchen itself, the confined space where the fatal confrontation occurred. The positioning of furniture, appliances, and potential hiding spots for a weapon were reviewed. Mark Jenkins' stated habit of keeping his gun accessible in the kitchen was confirmed by Sarah and indirectly by the gun's location. The physical environment, the motive of betrayal, and the forensic data now converged on this single room, demanding a detailed, almost clinical, reconstruction of the violent moments that shattered a suburban morning. The truth was buried in the blood, the bullets, and the conflicting accounts of a marriage's final, brutal seconds. The forensic evidence seemed to whisper a story that might not entirely align with the narrative of a desperate single act of self-preservation. The mounting forensic evidence, particularly the blood spatter and bullet trajectory analysis indicating Mark Jenkins was low or on the floor for at least some shots, presented a significant challenge to Sarah Jenkins' initial self-defense claim involving a standing struggle. Prosecutors began exploring alternative scenarios based on the physical evidence. Could the argument have led to a physical altercation where Mark was knocked or fell to the floor before being shot? Or were the shots fired after he was already incapacitated or attempting to retreat? Investigators brought in experts to analyze the kitchen scene data. Forensic reconstruction specialists worked to model the possible positions of Mark and Sarah Jenkins based on the bloodstains and bullet paths. Their findings suggested that at least 2 of the shots were fired downwards at a steep angle, consistent with the shooter standing over a victim who was on the floor. This starkly contradicted the image of a mutual struggle where both parties were upright. Sarah Jenkins was subjected to further interviews, this time with the forensic findings presented to her. Confronted with the analysis suggesting Mark was on the floor, her account became more distressed and fragmented. She did not explicitly change her story about a struggle, but her descriptions of the moments immediately preceding the shots became less certain, filled with terms like blur, panic, and I don't remember exactly. This inability or unwillingness to reconcile her narrative with the physical evidence became a key point for the prosecution. The timeline of Sarah Jenkins's discovery of the affair was also investigated more deeply. When exactly did she find the messages or hear the information? How long had she known? Had she confronted Mark previously? Had she confronted her sister Laura Miller? This line of questioning sought to establish the emotional state Sarah was in leading up to the shooting. Was it a sudden, explosive reaction to a fresh discovery that morning? Or was it the culmination of prolonged anguish and tension from knowing about the affair? Evidence suggested she had discovered the affair several days before the shooting, not just that morning. This implied a period of brooding and contemplation, potentially undermining a claim of sudden, heat-of-passion reaction without prior knowledge. Laura Miller, the sister, was interviewed again. Her statements remained guarded, but she confirmed some interactions with Sarah following the alleged discovery of the affair, though the nature and intensity of these conversations remained somewhat unclear. The emotional chasm created by the betrayal between the 2 sisters was palpable, even through the formal language of interview summaries. The prosecution began building a case for a more intentional act than simple self-defense. They argued that the forensic evidence suggested the shots were fired after the victim was no longer an immediate threat, likely on the ground. The fact that Sarah had known about the affair for some time, not just discovering it that morning, could be used to argue against a purely spontaneous act of self-defense in the heat of a sudden confrontation. The argument in the kitchen, while the immediate trigger, might have been the final stage of a slow-burn emotional crisis. The defense, however, would argue that the presence of Mark Jenkins' gun, his background as a police officer, and the inherent danger of a heated argument escalating could still lead to a genuine fear for safety, even if the physical struggle was brief or the victim ended up on the floor during the confrontation. They would emphasize the panic and fear Sarah described. The kitchen, the scene of domestic life, had become a battleground, and the truth of who initiated the final fatal confrontation, and the exact sequence of events, remained a subject of intense legal and forensic debate. The conflicting narratives laid bare the devastating intersection of private betrayal and public violence. The investigation culminated in the arrest of Sarah Jenkins, based on the forensic evidence suggesting Mark Jenkins was on the floor when at least some of the fatal shots were fired, coupled with the confirmed motive of the affair, and evidence she knew about it prior to that morning. The prosecution felt they had sufficient grounds to argue against a clear-cut case of self-defense. She was charged with homicide. The specific charge would depend on the prosecution's assessment of intent, potentially ranging from manslaughter to murder. The legal process was now formally underway, moving from investigation to prosecution. The arrest sent another shockwave through Ann Arbor, particularly within the police department and the local community. One of their detectives was dead, and his wife, the seemingly quiet woman from Elmwood Drive, was accused of killing him. The story of the affair with her own sister added a layer of tragic, almost Shakespearean drama to the grim facts. Public opinion began to form, often divided, grappling with the sensational elements of the case. Sarah Jenkins was arraigned, entering a plea of not guilty. A defense attorney was secured, immediately beginning the complex process of preparing for trial. The defense's strategy centered on the narrative of self-defense, portraying Sarah as a fearful wife reacting instinctively to perceived aggression from her husband during a volatile argument, especially given the presence of his accessible firearm and his training as an officer. They would challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the forensic evidence, perhaps arguing for alternative explanations for the blood spatter, or trajectories, or emphasizing the chaotic nature of a close-quarters struggle. Pre-trial motions became a crucial battleground, particularly regarding the admissibility of certain evidence, including the full extent of the affair details and Laura Miller's potential testimony. Laura Miller's position was unenviable. Her testimony would inevitably expose her relationship with the deceased, and her complex relationship with her sister, the accused. Her privacy was shattered by the violent outcome of her secret. The prosecution prepared its case, relying heavily on the forensic reconstruction of the scene, the autopsy findings, and the evidence that Sarah had prior knowledge of the affair. They would seek to portray the shooting as a deliberate act fueled by rage and betrayal, arguing that the opportunity to retreat or de-escalate existed, and that firing multiple shots, particularly at someone on the floor, went beyond reasonable self-defense. They would highlight the discrepancy between Sarah's account of a standing struggle and the physical evidence. The emotional toll on both families was immense. Mark Jenkins' parents and siblings grieved his loss, now compounded by the accusation against his wife. Sarah Jenkins' parents faced the horror of their daughter being charged with killing her husband, while simultaneously grappling with the betrayal involving their other daughter, Laura. Laura Miller herself retreated from public view, the subject of intense scrutiny and quiet condemnation. The private tragedy had become a very public spectacle. As the case moved towards trial, the weight of the evidence and the conflicting narratives settled over the community. The kitchen on Elmwood Drive, meticulously processed and analyzed, remained the silent witness. Its ordinary features, the countertops, the floor tiles, the cabinets, held the imprints of an extraordinary violence. The stage was set for a legal battle that would dissect the final moments of a marriage, attempting to determine intent and culpability amidst the ruins of betrayal and death. The path ahead was uncertain, promising painful revelations and difficult truths for everyone involved. The trial of Sarah Jenkins commenced several months later in the Washtenaw County Circuit Court. The courtroom, a formal, imposing space, became the arena where the intimate, violent details of the Elmwood Drive kitchen were laid bare. The prosecution presented its case first, calling investigators and forensic experts to the stand. Detective Rodriguez, the lead investigator, testified about the initial scene, the discovery of the body, and the collection of evidence. His testimony was measured, clinical, focusing on the objective facts of the immediate aftermath. Forensic experts followed, presenting their findings on blood spatter analysis, ballistics, and bullet trajectories. Anya Sharma, the medical examiner, calmly described the autopsy results, detailing the entry wounds and the path of the bullets, confirming Mark Jenkins was struck multiple times, including shots fired from an elevated position consistent with the shooter standing over him. A forensic reconstruction expert used diagrams and visual aids to demonstrate the probable positions of the victim and shooter, according to the physical evidence, starkly illustrating the prosecution's theory that the shots were fired when Mark was on the ground. Excerpts from Sarah Jenkins's interviews were played, highlighting inconsistencies in her initial statements and her difficulty reconciling her narrative with the forensic findings. The prosecution argued that her evolving account and the physical evidence pointed towards an intentional act, not a desperate, spontaneous reaction. They described the confrontation over the affair, arguing it provided a clear motive for lethal rage. The defense cross-examined prosecution witnesses rigorously, seeking to introduce doubt about the interpretation of the forensic evidence. They questioned whether the blood spatter analysis could definitively determine body positioning in a dynamic struggle. They raised the possibility that Mark Jenkins fell during the struggle, and the subsequent shots were fired in a continuing state of panic and self-preservation. Could these patterns also be consistent with someone falling and shots being fired milliseconds apart? The defense attorney challenged the forensic expert. Laura Miller was called to testify by the prosecution, a moment of intense tension in the courtroom. Her testimony was difficult, marked by visible distress. She confirmed the affair with Mark Jenkins, providing details about its duration and secrecy. She also testified about conversations with Sarah prior to the shooting, indicating Sarah knew about the affair. Under cross-examination, the defense pressed her on the nature of these conversations, attempting to elicit testimony that Sarah was deeply distressed, fearful, or potentially volatile after learning of the betrayal. Laura's answers were often brief, confirming the facts of the affair and Sarah's knowledge, but offering limited insight into Sarah's specific mental state. The courtroom felt the weight of the shattered family bonds laid bare. The defense presented its case, focusing on Sarah Jenkins' state of mind and the dynamics of the argument. They called character witnesses who described Sarah as nonviolent, reserved, and a loving wife. Before the affair was known, they presented a psychologist who testified about the psychological impact of discovering a spouse's infidelity, particularly with a family member, and how it could lead to extreme emotional distress and a dissociative state during a confrontation. This testimony aimed to support the idea that Sarah acted in a moment of intense panic and emotional turmoil, her actions not necessarily premeditated but a reaction to immediate threat as she perceived it. Sarah Jenkins herself testified. This was the emotional core of the defense. She recounted the morning of the shooting from her perspective, the confrontation about the affair, Mark's alleged aggression, her fear when he reached for the gun, the struggle, and the moments of firing the weapon, which she described as a blur of panic and terror. Under cross-examination, the prosecution pressed her on the forensic evidence, challenging her account of a standing struggle and the multiple shots. Her voice broke at times, describing the betrayal and the horror of the subsequent moments. The courtroom was silent, hanging on her every word, attempting to reconcile her tearful testimony with the cold, hard facts of the physical evidence. Closing arguments summarized the competing narratives. The prosecution painted a picture of betrayal, rage, and a deliberate act of violence, supported by forensic evidence, suggesting the victim was incapacitated when shot. The defense argued for panic, fear, and a tragic act of self-preservation by a woman pushed to her breaking point, emphasizing the chaotic nature of a struggle and the potential for misinterpretation of forensic data in such a dynamic event. The fate of Sarah Jenkins now rested with the jury, tasked with navigating the complex intersection of human emotion, betrayal, and the silent testimony of the Elmwood Drive kitchen. The jury in the trial of Sarah Jenkins deliberated for 2 days. Their task was to weigh the evidence presented, the competing narratives, and the legal definitions of the charges, which likely included options ranging from first-degree murder, premeditated, to second-degree murder, intentional but not premeditated, to voluntary manslaughter, killing in the heat of passion or imperfect self-defense, to acquittal, justified self-defense. The complex nature of the forensic evidence, the emotional context of the affair, and Sarah's state of mind during the shooting all contributed to the difficulty of their decision. Ultimately, the jury returned a verdict of guilty, but on a lesser charge than initially sought by the prosecution. They found Sarah Jenkins guilty of voluntary manslaughter. This verdict indicated that the jury believed Sarah Jenkins caused the death of Mark Jenkins, and that she did so intentionally or with the intent to cause serious bodily harm, but that she acted in the heat of passion or under a sudden and intense provocation. The confrontation about the affair, potentially combined with perceived aggression, that would cause a reasonable person to lose self-control. It also suggested they were not fully convinced by the pure self-defense claim, but acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of the highly charged emotional context. The forensic evidence likely played a significant role in discrediting the standing struggle aspect of her account, while the context of the affair and confrontation supported the heat of passion element. The reading of the verdict in the courtroom was met with a heavy silence. Sarah Jenkins showed little outward reaction, her face pale and drawn. Her family members wept quietly. Mark Jenkins' family members sat stoically, the verdict offering a form of legal resolution, but no solace for their loss. The finding of voluntary manslaughter carried a significant prison sentence, though less than that for murder. Sentencing occurred several weeks later. The courtroom was again filled with family and observers. Victim impact statements were read by members of Mark Jenkins' family, describing their grief, the void left by his death, and the pain caused by the circumstances of his killing and the ensuing public trial. They spoke of his life, his career as a police officer, and the future that was stolen from him. The defense presented arguments for leniency, highlighting Sarah Jenkins' lack of prior criminal history, her perceived character before the incident, the extreme emotional provocation she experienced, and the devastating consequences she had already suffered, including the public humiliation and the loss of her husband, regardless of the circumstances of his death. Sarah herself made a brief statement, expressing remorse for the events, but maintaining that she acted out of fear during a moment of intense chaos. The judge, in delivering the sentence, acknowledged the tragic nature of the case, the profound betrayal that preceded the violence, and the irreversible loss of life. The judge weighed the jury's finding of voluntary manslaughter, acknowledging the element of heat of passion, but also the fatal outcome. Sarah Jenkins was sentenced to a term of imprisonment in a state correctional facility. The specific length of the sentence was determined by state sentencing guidelines for voluntary manslaughter, taking into account aggravating and mitigating factors. The doors of the Washtenaw County Circuit Court closed on the legal proceedings, but the echoes of the violence in the Elmwood Drive kitchen lingered. The house itself, the scene of the crime, stood as a silent, grim monument to the private agony that erupted into public tragedy. It was eventually sold, new occupants perhaps never fully knowing the full weight of the history within its walls. The lives of everyone connected. Sarah Jenkins, now a convicted felon, serving time. Laura Miller, forever marked by her role in the betrayal and its aftermath. The grieving families on both sides, the community in Ann Arbor that watched the drama unfold, were irrevocably altered. A cop slept with his sister-in-law. His wife shot him in the kitchen. The facts, stripped bare, revealed a story of human fallibility, devastating secrets, and the sudden, violent cost of betrayal within the most ordinary of settings. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of a profound, lasting emptiness.